All right, I have with me today former CIA employee Ray McGovern. We've got some big topics. We're going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to talk about corruption within the CIA and the White House. We're also going to talk about some breaking news about China and their diplomacy efforts to undermine the United States. In speaking with Zelensky from Ukraine and some other big topics. Ray, thank you so much for being on today's show again.
You're most welcome, Stephen.
Last time we had you on, people really appreciated your feedback and your wisdom. That video has close to 900,000 views, so I expect this video to be just as informative and well received. I'm going to put your website down below for people to click and go to. They can also sign up for my newsletter. They can also learn about the cash giveaway that my wife and I are doing. But let's jump into the first question. As you know, former acting head of the CIA, Michael Morell, was contacted by now Secretary of State Antony Blinken, where he was asked to draft a phony and fraudulent letter with other heads of security agencies in order to deceive the American people about the Hunter Biden laptop being Russian disinformation right before the 2020 election. Why would a former head of CIA insert himself into a politically hot topic right before an election in order to deceive the American people?
I'm not quite sure, Stephen, whether the adjective should be shameless or shameful.
Okay.
Number one, an intelligence professional, even though retired, should not be inserting himself into this kind of rigmarole politically. That said, everyone has a First Amendment right, but this fellow, Mikey Morell, it's very clear he wanted to be head of the CIA under Clinton, but she lost. Under Biden, he won, but he didn't pick him, Under Clinton, 2016, during that campaign, Morell wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, very much on Hillary's side. The title was, "I used to run the CIA, now I'm voting for Hillary Clinton." What could be more blatant than that? So there are personal equities here, personal aims, with also the fact that Morell has always been a tool for what I call the deep state, the fellows who run things really. And if they decide, well, Biden much better for our purposes than this Trump guy who we can't predict and who actually criticizes us out loud, for God's sake, you don't do that to the intelligence analysts, okay? Then they'll do what they can. Now, I don't know exactly what effect that had on the outcome of the 2020 election, but you can't tell me it didn't have some effect. And it was fraudulent from the get-go. And what happened when the New York Post came out with the story on Hunter's black laptop? Those fellows, the CIA and FBI alumni in Twitter, knocked the New York Post off Twitter. And the whole thing was a black hole. Now, I'll share a little personal thing here, Stephen. It's a little embarrassing. I could see it was fraudulent. I know that I knew of those guys. A couple of the guys I actually were around when I was there. They're really not the kind of guys I would even want to have a beer with. Okay. So what did I do at the time? Well, I criticized, this is, without evidence, how can you say this is a Russian? This is all the earmarks of a Russian deception. Give me a break. It's just like earlier things they accused the Russians of. But what I did, and this is what sort of shameful for me, I kept my mouth shut. Why? To keep peace in the family.
Yeah.
so that nobody would say, "Oh my God, Trump won again, and you helped him win." Now, when I say a shame, I feel a little shame about that. Okay, but Glenn Greenwald didn't do that. He had the guts to do precisely what was required, and what happened? He lost his job from the firm that he had established. For God's sake, the Intercept. So all I'm saying here is that the freight, the public opprobrium attached to having anything to do with a possible Trump win again was enough to say, well, let this one go, Ray. We know that Stephanopoulos, when he talks to candidate Biden, he's not going to ask him about this. Everybody should realize I really hate the fact that my former colleagues are getting involved in this, but hey, let this one go. And then you won't have to worry about if Trump wins. So that's how thick this was, you know. So all I'm saying here is that the only interesting thing I see with respect to, I try to avoid adjectives that come to mind. Mikey Morell, okay, he's a tool, okay. So here's the question: why did he throw Tony Blinken under the bus at this particular point in time?
Yes. Okay. Okay.
All right, now that's a big dot, it seems to me. Now it could be connected with other dots. It's a little bit speculative, but one could speculate that there are whole people in our government that resent the fix that Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland have gotten us into in Ukraine. The lies they've told, and some of which are now being revealed. So there's at least, in my view, a faction on our government, probably in the intelligence services, probably at the Pentagon, saying these guys are from hunger. I mean, let's get Blinken the hell out of there. Maybe Sullivan is educable, maybe not, but at least let's do something to get rid of Blinken. Now, will this work? I don't know, but the only sensible reason for the timing, it seems to me, is Mikey Morell getting the go-ahead. Yeah, let's throw Blinken under the bus, and maybe we can get out of this without a nuclear war.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting to me is there's a lot of speculation that the person really running the White House is Susan Rice. And she just announced that she's leaving the White House. She doesn't want to be involved in Biden's administration anymore. And this was, I think, 2 days before he said he was going to announce his run. So is this maybe people scattering so that their name's not attached to this? They don't think he's going to be a great wartime president-elect? Or do they think he's going to lose, and so they're getting out while they still have a reputation? Why would the person that everyone believes is really running the White House abandon the White House right before the chief announces he's going to go 4 more years?
Good question, Stephen, as usual. I'm not sure she was that influential in the White House. After all, she has a domestic portfolio. Sure, behind the scenes, she knows a lot more than, well, everyone knows a lot more than Sullivan. But, rats do desert the sinking ship right quick. That the comparison is not nice, but yeah, I think that's reasonable to assume. I looked at the way Biden had been delaying his announcement that he'd run again. And I kind of thought, well, maybe these leaks have something to do with that. Maybe the throwing Blinken under the bus has something to do with that. Maybe there's a strong faction that really doesn't want Biden to run again. Well, for whatever reason, he dissed all that. He's going to run again. So, Bryce, I expect others will be deserting the ship, sinking or not. I was really appalled that Biden announced he's going to do it. He's almost as old as I am, Stephen. my dad was a lawyer, right? And he made up these legal terms like the age of statutory senility. Now he was chancellor of the Board of Regents of the state of New York in his 60s and early 70s. And he made the point. He said, I'm going to resign as chancellor now. And looking around all these superannuated people hung on as regents, right, the board of regents, he said, you know, you might want to think, I've reached the age of statutory senility, 75. I'm leaving after the next meeting. And some of you might want to think, guess how many others did that? Zero.
Yeah.
So it's a problem. When you get real old, you don't want to. You want to cling to these things, you know. And for Biden, as debilitated as he seems to be, and has as non compass mentis, if I may, well, I think he has already reached the age of statutory senility. I don't think he can win, not even against Trump. And so for the Democrats to go ahead with him is something that, well, it wouldn't surprise me because nothing surprises me anymore what the Democrats do. Bobby Kennedy Jr. is a person to watch.
Yeah.
And I see a similarity here between 1967, 68 in Vietnam when things really went south, right? And Johnson had to recognize he wasn't winning. He wasn't going to be able to get more troops from Congress. And so he decided, go to negotiations, throw in the towel, and announce, I am not running for another term. He did that on March 31st, 1968. What was the other reasons? The other reasons were Bobby Kennedy, Gene McCarthy. They are polling Johnson up in Maine and elsewhere. So they had writings on the wall. Now, is it possible that there's a parallel here with Bobby Kennedy Jr. challenging Joe Biden? I don't know. I'm not an expert in domestic politics, but it gives me some hope that there will be some challenge and some rational thinking on the part of the Democrats, as rare as that has been over recent months and even years.
Yeah, he's an interesting character. I think he's going to give Biden a run for his money. Let's switch gears here. Now that China has, basically publicly connected themselves to Russia, is there any chance that China is going to allow Russia to lose the war with Ukraine, or are they going to look for or provide an off ramp for one of their bigger trading partners? So that China doesn't have egg on their face if their partner Russia were to, quote unquote, lose this war?
Well, in answer to your question, will China permit Russia to lose this war? The answer is no. The alliance is rock solid now, and it includes, obviously, evidently, I mean, it includes a military dimension. Now, the Chinese and the Russians have this little pact. We're not going to talk about a military alliance or a mutual defense. No, that's always aimed against somebody. We're not against anybody. But we do cooperate. Now, one of the odd things, Stephen, is how Blinken and Sullivan get this benighted view that Russia and China really hate each other. They'll really never get together. That Russia, if it comes, that China is going to dominate Russia. Where are they getting this stuff? Well, one person kind of comes to mind. His name is Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, and actually head of the National Security Council section on Russia under Obama. Now, I don't know where he gets his worldview, but after the very clear demonstration of an alliance between Xi Jinping, who came to Moscow, and Putin, and after Xi Jinping is overheard saying, this is a 100-year tectonic shift in world relations, and we're driving this ship. Okay. After that, McFaul comes out and he says, Putin has humiliated Xi Jinping. Huh? Yeah, right.
Okay.
There was a joint statement, and in that joint statement, it said no nuclear weapon deployments or storage or put in other countries. We oppose that together. Now, Putin is saying he might do that, or he's going to do that in Belarus. So The Chinese are going to react very angrily. It's not going to go down good in Beijing. Yeah, you know. I mean, it was boilerplate. I was right out of all the others. You always include that in that kind of journalism. All right, so what happens? The next day, the Chinese Defense Ministry announces more accelerated bilateral exercises, more, and then the defense minister from China appears in Moscow just within this past week, and the demonstration of military cooperation is closer than ever before. So, my point is simply that when you see Biden getting up and saying, as he did about 5 months ago, I don't think Xi Jinping has a good opinion. I don't think he really trusts Putin. Where the hell is he getting that? From the likes of Michael McFaul, who also told Biden at the first summit, July 16, 2021. He told Biden that the Chinese are really fresh. Well, what he said was, well, we know this because it's the only thing that really came out of the summit. Biden, in the post-summit conversation with reporters, said, this is be inappropriate to say what I actually told President Putin, but he has a long thousands of mile border with China, and he knows that China aspires not only to be the primary economic but a military and political power, and so Putin knows that he's being squeezed by the Chinese. That's what McFaul and the likes of those people told Biden to tell Putin. Now, I would have loved a bit of a fly on the wall when Putin turns to his colleagues after watching the boob tube, watching the TV, and Biden is saying these things. Huh? What? Where does he get this stuff? And I have to tell you, Stephen, the next year, so we're talking June 2021, the next year plus, the Chinese and the Russians did everything in their human power to demonstrate how close they were, and now they've made it completely unambiguous. What does that mean? That means it's 2-1. And let me just finish with this, because it's worth repeating. You really need to pay heed to what Chinese and Russian leaders say, and what Biden said about, not Biden, what Putin said about this at Valdai back in October was this question and answer period, right? Question, President Putin, what do you make of the fact that the Americans are picking a fight with the Chinese, as well as supplying all kinds of armaments and getting involved in Ukraine? Does that make any sense to you? And Putin's memorized his answer. He says, it doesn't really hold any logic to it, does it? It doesn't make any sense. I think they're crazy. His word. Yeah. And then he says, originally I thought there might be some sort of subtle plan behind this, but I no longer think so. I think it's simply a matter of arrogance and a feeling of impunity, end quote. Now, I think so too. I think that's the only way to explain this sort of thing. But it doesn't matter what McGovern thinks. What matters is what Putin thinks, and his military, and how they have to be on tenterhooks if these guys are crazy. And maybe they're not certifiably crazy, but they're crazy to pick a two-front war and pick fights with the two other dominant powers, nuclear powers in this world. So the degree of real volatility here and unnecessary tentativeness with respect to the strategic situation.
Okay. You let me know right before we went on that there was breaking news that Zelensky had asked Xi Jinping of China to have a diplomatic phone call. We know that over the last year with the Biden administration, the acts of diplomacy have been eroding, and that's created a vacuum where China now feels like they can fill the space with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and now with Zelensky. Two questions for you. Number one, do you think that NATO gave their blessing for Zelensky to get on the phone without them with Xi Jinping? And number two, is there anyone out there right now other than China that could start to broker peace, such as Lukashenko of Belarus or Donald Trump or somebody that Putin feels comfortable with? I'll let you answer those two questions.
Okay, now the first one was.
Do you think that NATO gave their blessing for
Okay, gotcha.
Zelensky and Xi Jinping to have this communication?
Gotcha. By NATO, Stephen, I'm sure you mean the United States, because NATO really is okay. So did the U.S. give its blessing? That's the key question. Again, you put your finger. I don't know the answer to that, but the answer is all important. What am I saying here? I'm saying that there's a faction that I see in the U.S. government, in probably the military, the intelligence services, and almost maybe in the State Department, that see the Ukrainian escapade as really a dumb thing to do and are looking for a way out. Now, there are lots of hints about this. Witness these recent leaks and the four headlines that the Washington Post ran with right after the leaks were exposed, as if they had been primed. Ukraine running out of ammunition. Ukraine not able to defend itself from air attack starting mid-May. No solutions possible before next year. DIA says no question about any negotiation. All these things, boom, 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 boom. Then, of course, and the BBC did the same thing during those 5 days. Then it kind of petered off. I see this, especially with the Post. They don't do anything without checking with whoever in the administration is telling them what to do. Somebody's telling them, play this. And it shows that Austin, Secretary of Defense, Blinken, Nod, Sullivan, and Amy, no, squeeze, Madame Fatal, Tory, Newland, are lying through their teeth, misleading the American people to think that Ukraine could possibly win a war against Russia. Okay, so let's get that message out. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that, well, maybe these same people are saying, look, Volodymyr Zelensky, it's time to deal. Now, there are ways to do this. The Chinese have put this proposal out. Why don't you get them to call you, for God's sake, and see if we can work this around these troglodytes in the White House? Okay. Now, when Xi Jinping was in Moscow, the reports preceding that visit and during it said, "Oh, on his way out, he's gonna, or maybe on his way in, he's gonna call Zelensky too. They're gonna, or maybe he stopped in Kiev." Never happened. Never happened. Why? Well, they didn't perceive that there would be any point, that is, the Chinese, in talking to Zelensky. So why do they say yes now? What Xi Jinping explicitly says is, they asked me for this telephone conversation. So it came from the initiative of the Ukrainians. Zelensky, the Chinese are offering a way out. First, a ceasefire, then kind of negotiations, so kind of freeze the conflict, stop the blood. That's the first thing you do. Stop the bleeding, for God's sake. So Zelensky has done this now. The Chinese have said, now we're going to send the representative, high-level representative from China, to go to Ukraine and deal with this. We're going to accept the Ukrainian ambassador back in China. We've had a long trade relationship with Ukraine. We're going to try to use our influence to get the blood to stop here, the bleeding to stop. So is this all done, your original question, with the U.S. approval or even encouragement? I believe with some of the guys in the Pentagon or in the White House, the more reasonable ones who think there's really got to be a way out of this thing, and Zelensky has got to listen to reason, but I'm not sure about that. We'll have to see in the coming weeks whether Zelensky feels free enough to follow the people that make sense of the White House and at the same time face up to the Nazis who are equally powerful to Zelensky and could easily say, no, look, you want that? You get out of here. You go back to the Riviera where you belong, and we're going to put our own person in there. So it's a very labil, as the Germans would say, very tentative situation there. But this new Chinese initiative is very real. And when the Chinese say we're sending an emissary, we're going to get really into the thick of this thing. And when they pretend to be still firm adherents to the principles of Westphalia, of 1648, you don't invade neighbors, or you respect international borders and all that kind of stuff. When they keep to that rhetoric, well, it gives them a certain dignity, I suppose, even though, and this is the key point here, even though Xi Jinping in February of last year gave Putin a waiver on Westphalia. Even Chinese rhetoric changed for a month or two, saying, what's really important is we judge each situation on its own merits. And we think that people have to defend their own core interests. We in Taiwan, the Russians in Ukraine. So the Chinese rhetoric is really nice, but they did carve out this exception. And to pretend that the Chinese are really kind of above the fray here and not right in the thick of things with Russia is misleading. It's the kind of thing that McFaul and other people, benighted people, might think and might tell Biden to think, if he's thinking very much these days.
Thank you. You reminded me, I forget this all the time because I don't want to believe it, but I keep forgetting that there's like basically a cartel of Nazis in Ukraine that secretly run the country. I always forget this because I want to believe that Nazism has been destroyed. But you're saying that Zelensky has to walk this razor's edge between keeping the Nazi cartel of Ukraine happy as well as the NATO nations?
Well, that's right. When Zelensky campaigned, he campaigned on improving relations with Russia. He won a major victory. It was pretty one-sided. Next thing he did, he went out to the Donbass, where the Azov, the Nazi battalion, and other parts of the far right were running the military affairs there. And he said, okay, now would you please stop shelling the Russian-speaking people there in Lugansk and Donetsk? And I looked at him and said, who the hell are you? Oh, I'm President. I'm President Zelensky. Get out of here. Now, where do I have that from? From the Ukrainian press, for God's sake.
Yeah.
They reported all this. And what did he do? He got out of there. So Zelensky is not his own man, either within Kiev and Ukraine, or with respect to the United States. I wouldn't want to be in his position, but he's a terrific actor. Isn't he a wonderful actor? And that's his forte. And he serves the purpose of those people who are pulling the strings. He serves it magnificently. And when it's time for him to go, and I suspect that will be within the next year, he has lots of places like the Riviera and the Seychelles and other really nice places to go to with lots of money. A lot of it's skimmed off from the aid that we American taxpayers have been giving to this enterprise.
Yeah. Okay. Final question. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I've been reading in some European news outlets that they are claiming that Poland is kind of secretly hoping that Ukraine will lose the war, or at least become so beleaguered and beaten down that NATO might assign Western Ukraine back to Poland, because they used to be under the Poland Empire anyway, just like they're saying Russia wants part of Ukraine because they used to be a part of Mother Russia and the USSR. Do you think there's any truth to Poland hoping that they could maybe pick up Western Ukraine?
Well, I would say, Stephen, there are always starry-eyed people, and the Poles are among those folks, a lot of them. The interesting thing here has to do with Russian history. You know, when they finally got the trappings of a government together and a language, did you know there was no written Russian language until the 10th century AD?
I did not.
Yeah, it was constructed. They had a very rich oral tradition. They had epic poetry of the likes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. One Slovo a polku Igorevie. It's a beautiful thing, but they had no way of writing it down. And so two priests came up from Macedonia, Cyril and Methodius. You probably have heard of these. And they manufactured a written language for them. They took the Greek letters and the Latin letters, some Hebrew letters, and they had to manufacture some for Shah and stuff like that. So in the 10th century, it became sort of a real dynamic trading partner, Byzantium and so forth. And then they were involved. Then they were invaded by the Mongols. Yeah, the Mongols invaded. Okay, Genghis Khan. Okay. Would you believe 2 centuries and 40 years they spent under Mongol rule? They call it the Tatarske Iga. Okay, it was terrible. Okay, so as Western Europe is coming out of the Dark Ages, right? The Russians are just finally getting rid of the invasion from the east, and what happens? Oh, the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Hanseatic League and Sweden descend on Russia from the west. Okay, it took decades to fight them off. So here's the history behind it. Talk about Lithuania and talk about Poland. Yeah, they did it already before. Okay. Do they want to do it again? I suppose there are starry-eyed people like to do it again. And, you know, I warn against bipolar poles. I mean, it's very, very, very dicey on that border with Ukraine. You know, I would, if push comes to shove, the Poles might just inject themselves in a way that would embarrass NATO and would force Washington to decide that we really want to support the Poles and, you know, and defend Warsaw by risking retaliatory strikes against London or even Washington. These are really cold calculations the Poles are capable of doing, of facilitating or catalyzing these kinds of situations. So I worry about the Poles. I don't know whether they have their eyes on that part of Cilicia there, that part of Ukraine that the Poles had ruled before, but there's also some history in Polish-Ukrainian relations when Bandera, the Nazi, was in power helping the SS during World War II. They killed tens of thousands of Poles, Hungarians, Russians, and Jews. Okay, so that's part of the history as well.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, it made it sound like they wouldn't militarily go in, but if it was assigned to them, they would take it over since they've already taken in millions and millions of Ukrainians. But Ray McGovern, thank you so much. I know your time is valuable, and I just want to thank you so much for coming on. Is raymcgovern.com the best place for people to learn more about you and stay in touch?
That would be great. Yeah, that's my website. And I post there not only my articles, interviews such as the one we just did, and what speeches I make as well.
Great. Thank you so much for being on today's show.
Most welcome, Stephen. Take care.